All right, hands of the week. All right, so let's look at a hand that King Henry played on Hustler Casino Live. Henry, the king of the shirts. He's got good shirts.
He has the best shirts.
You think he's ever worn the same shirt twice?
I think he just burns it, probably.
After he wears it?
Not while he's wearing it.
Maybe he's wearing a fireproof shirt under his shirt.
Maybe you should stick to poker, because I don't think fire is going to be the area that you're going to excel.
All right, let's talk about this hand. 25, 50, 100, 100 big blind ante. We're going to play this hand from Henry's perspective. Francisco limps from the hijack.
He's generally a player. If he's limping, he's intending to see a flop. So I wouldn't expect us to have a ton of fold equity if we were just like next to act and we see Francisco put in $100.
And so speaking of next act, Will next act here with the ace deuce off, ISOs to 300. What you think of this one, big boy?
Gambling it up a little bit. That's part of what Hustler is an entertainment show. It's not just about the poker. But ace deuce off, clearly not strong enough a hand with 4 people to act after you. Not to mention the fact that if I am going to be ISOing here, I'm going to be using a bigger size than 3x, I think. I want to punish this limper. And
punish.
You do love to punish. Ace deuce off is a fair few pips too wide.
So just go stronger. And choose a bigger size here because Francisco's not limping to limp fold. Ling Ling calls on the button. We don't have to talk about too much. Like you said, it's a stream game. It's a funny hand. 6-9 offsuit, whatever. She's there to have some fun. That's pretty much all there is to it. Comes around to Henry in the big blind here. And the first interesting decision point of many interesting decision points for Henry in his hand is what do we do with King 10 suited here?
If we call, we're going to be up against some pretty wide ranges with a pretty strong hand. But I think that there's more merits to a squeeze here. When we see Will only ISOing to 3 big blinds, obviously we have the benefit of seeing that he's doing it as wide as ace deuce off, but just knowing how wide stream games go, it allows us to expand that strong linear 3-betting range, and I think King 10 falls into that range.
And when you say strong linear, you just mean good hands, better hands,
Papa John's,
best hands. We probably don't want to take a hand like 9-7 suited or something like that here.
That big left-hand block of a I don't actually know what that. Do you know what that's called? The old top left-hand side of the
left-hand snippet.
The left-hand snippet of the, what is it? A chart? I don't even know.
Balloon.
The left-hand snippet of the hand balloon chart will be the hands that you're going to want to be 3-betting in a linear range.
So Henry does call, and we go 4 ways. In the flop, it is a doozy. 9-6-8 with the 6 and 8 of clubs, so Henry flops a combo draw. I think it's interesting in this spot. This hand, there's a lot of donking involved in this hand. We talk about donks a lot at Hungry Horse Poker. We talk about 2 different scenarios. When we want to check range and when we want to work in some donks. And it's 2 very different scenarios. Let me break them down for you. Scenario 1, when we want to work in some donks. And this is a scenario when the flop is very, very likely to get checked through. In this type of scenario, there may be players who are going to naturally check in flow to the pre-flop raiser. So, say for example, under the gun limps, hijack limps, pre-flop raiser raises from the button, and we call from the big blind, right? In this scenario, the 2 limpers are almost always going to check to the pre-flop raiser, and the pre-flop raiser is going to have to be very tight with the c-betting, being 3 or 4 or 5 ways here on the flop. So this spot would be very, very likely to get checked through. Let's talk about the corollary here, where, say, pre-flop raiser raises under the gun, hijack calls, cutoff calls, button calls, and then we're in the big blind. In this scenario, the flop is very, very likely to be bet, right? Because even if the pre-flop raiser checks, there's 3 players behind the pre-flop raiser who now have a chance to bet. So even if each player is only going to bet 25-30% of the time, very, very high chance that this flop gets bet. So when the flop is likely to get bet, we want to do a lot of checking. We want to check our range because we can see what happens and then make an informed decision. When the flop is very, very likely to get checked through, that's when we want to work in some donks.
I think one of the other factors about donking is it tends to reduce fold equity. If we're looking to generate folds, often a check raise is going to be a more effective way to build a pot and also to generate folds.
And when you do have a combo draw, one of your goals here is kind of to maximize fold equity. One of the hangups that people get caught up in is they start thinking, is this board good for my range? If so, then yes, donk. If no, then no donk. Whereas I think the 2 most important factors, what you talked about and what I talked about, is what's the goal of our hand? Well, we want to maximize fold equity. How do we do that? We go for the check raise. And then also thinking about, is this spot likely to get bet? when we do have a hand that maybe wants to minimize fold equity.
We're not necessarily throwing theory completely out the window, but it isn't the primary driver. And if it's the only thought you have on the flop, you're probably missing opportunities to exploit some of these players who theory just isn't a part of their game.
If you're playing equilibrium poker against someone who can't even spell equilibrium, it's probably not the best strategy. So Henry actually does decide to go for the donk here, very small donk, and Francisco is going to call here with an open and straight draw, backdoor flush draw. Will is going to get out of the way, and now Ling Ling on the button is going to go for a big raise here with her 2 pair, and now it is back to Henry, who has decision point number 2 on this flop. How are you thinking about this spot?
Well, the first thing I think is important is to recognize this is a wet dynamic board. And one of the traits that you'll see on these wet dynamic boards is people do a lot of fast playing with made hands. So when I see Ling Ling put in a pretty hefty raise multi-way here, I'm not expecting her to be doing this with a ton of draws. Against a range that is, for the majority, thick value hands, I don't think that putting in an additional bet here against the type of range I would anticipate her having makes a ton of sense.
Henry agrees with you, and Henry goes for the call. And the turn now is a king, which on the surface looks like a good card for Henry, who now makes top pair, but in reality doesn't really change all that much. So maybe Henry does now beat hands like 9x of clubs, or a hand like ace-x of clubs that would raise the flop at a small frequency.
But when we have the 10 of clubs in our hand, I think more of her hands are likely to be 2 pairs, sets, and straights. And against 2 pairs, well, improving to top pair doesn't actually put us ahead of very much of her range.
So Henry checks over in flow, and now Ling Ling here goes with a big bet. She bets pot here, 8,000 on this turn. And we talk a lot about carrying a logical, coherent thread all the way through and connecting the pieces from pre-flop to flop to turn. And I think what we're able to deduce now on this turn, we thought she was heavily weighted towards value hands with maybe some combo draws. I think when she takes this size on the turn, the 9x of clubs probably either slows down or chooses a smaller size or doesn't raise the flop in the first place. Same with the ace-x of clubs. And so at this point, I'm thinking she has sets, 2 pair, straights. Does it look like Henry has like marshmallow pads under his shoulders?
Those arms are not... They can't possibly be filling out those sleeves.
It looks like he's wearing a muscle suit under the shirt.
It's incredible. I mean, the man's put in some time. Like, he must be lifting a lot of very heavy chips.
So Henry does elect to go for the call here. We go to a river, which is a beautiful one. 3 of clubs.
Talk to me about how you'd be thinking once we see this 3 of clubs on the river.
Well, first of all, we think about her range, and we think her range is going to be 2 pair, sets, straights. Okay, so we have the best hand here. The thing is, what happens if we check? I think even a hand like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, checks back almost all the time. So she's going to check back sets. She's going to check back 2 pairs. She might even check back straights. You have to start thinking, how do we get the money here? I think we have to just put in the money ourselves here. Talk about your kind of theory about live players need to be shown something twice.
When a recreational player likes their hand and they believe they have a strong hand, in order to get them to fold, you're going to have to sell them on the story that you have a stronger hand more than once. In fact, at least twice. You're going to need to check raise the turn and then jam on the river. If you just jam on the river, you're really only telling them your story once. And most people, in my experience, don't buy a story that's only told to them once. You really have to sell it with multiple aggressive actions. So what that allows us to do on spots like this is to donk the river in a spot where if you were to ask Henry, name the bluffs you have here, I think there would be a long pause and then he'd start telling you about his newest shirt. Ling Ling has one of the weakest hands she can have in this spot, but she's still not able to fold this hand because on the flop she loved her hand, and on the turn she loved her hand. And we're only telling her once when we donk, even though the most obvious draw comes in. So often in my experience, people aren't willing to accept that their hand is no longer best, and they still end up paying us off on these rivers.
So Henry ends up donking all in. She tanks and tanks and tanks, and she knows, but
she knows she's beat.
She can't help it, makes the call, and Henry wins a nice little pot.